Hello, Maria. Thank you that you agreed to speak with us. And the first question is about the plan of Elon Musk. I know that this topic of peace negotiation, Russian-Ukrainian conflict is the main topic for you during the last, I think, last 8 years. And could you tell more what you think about this proposition of Elon Musk, and is it acceptable or maybe it's absolutely impossible? Let's begin from the first point of his plan: redirection of annexed regions under UN supervision. Russia leaves if that is will of people.
Hello. First of all, I think that the position of Elon Musk and actually the number of his tweets is like very good example, very good elegant example how people which have absolutely no knowledge on the area somehow thinks right now that they can offer some proposals or ideas like they're experts in international law, in resolution of the conflicts. It's to me it's some kind of ignorance and arrogance to some extent. But of course, if to assess these proposals from, let's say, conflict resolution point of view, they are absolutely useless. And if the final idea is to create secure environment for Ukraine, is to stop the aggression and prevent Russia from any attempts, at least in the coming years, of new offensive. So we cannot and should not and don't have actually to rely on ideas like conduct some kind of voting or referendums in the areas which are conflict affected ones. So first of all, any area which is the battlefield actually, and which was under the occupation, has to be absolutely liberated from these occupational forces, and no referendums either with UN supervision or with Ukrainian, let's say, electoral commissions. Nothing is possible until there are some troops of another state. So that's the obvious and the absolutely necessary a precondition. Secondly, even if the area is liberated, so any other voting process cannot actually happen the very next day, months, or as experts on voting processes claim, even maybe the year or couple of years. It depends on the time of occupation. And that's why, by the way, Ukraine insisted for many years that in Donbas, which that part of Donbas which was occupied after 2014, there was a need of transition period and no elections could be possible just in the framework of this, let's say, reintegration process, just in a couple of months of the decision on these elections. And the third idea about this kind of supervision is that Ukraine, the very basic rule for United Nations, this is one of the basic principles in the United Nations Charter, is that territorial sovereignty of any state cannot and must not be violated. The very idea of conducting the referendum on Ukrainian soil of some regions of Ukraine contradicts the United Nations Charter, because we don't have any nations, any ethnic groups in Kherson, Zaporizhia, or Donbas region, and that's why this idea it's just the playing on the side of Russia to me, consciously or unconsciously. But this goes in line what Russia wants, because what Putin did in his decrees about so-called annexation, he declared that Zaporizhia region of Ukraine and Kherson region of Ukraine, on the basis of self-determination rule from United Nations Charter, declared their independence from Ukraine. That's what's stated in his decree. But there is no any nation in Zaporizhia region. That's Ukrainian nation, and and that's why when Elon Musk, having no knowledge on that, just offers to conduct the same referendums with Russian actually troops on the ground, or formally withdrawn, which of course will never happen voluntarily from the Russian side, to conduct referendums. It's actually the same idea which was used by Putin with his sham referendums.
What about his next point, Crimea formally part of Russia, as it has been since 1783 until Khrushchev's mistake? It's his words, very strange, but it's his opinion.
That's again everything what is repeated in the Russian TV channels, that this is undermining of the very idea of international recognition of borders of sovereign modern states. Crimea was occupied, and Ukraine does not need to rely on the fact that at some point 100 or 200 years ago, some territories of Ukraine belonged to another states, like to Austria or Austria-Hungarian Empire or to Russian Empire. Because if to follow this logic, then let's conduct some kind of not a referendum, but let's leave a part of Finland, for instance, to the Russia, because up to 1917, the very end of 1917, Finland was a part of Russian Empire actually, and declared independence just 2 months before Ukrainian state declared independence from collapsing Russian Empire in January 1918. So that's absolutely misleading logic. Crimea was recognized by international community, by to United Nations and by the Russia itself in the framework of number of bilateral agreements, including treaty on friendship, by the way, international treaty ratified by parliaments and so on, recognized as other regions of Ukraine as the part of Ukraine. And the unilateral decision of Russia to occupy Ukraine 8 years ago on the basis of some kind of propaganda that 200 years ago, some parts of Ukraine were part of Russian Empire, that's not the logic which should be now laid down in the foreign policy of any country, including Russia.
Mm-hmm. And two last points: water supply to Crimea assured, and Ukraine remains neutral. What do you think about it?
To international audience, I try constantly to repeat that in 2010, Ukrainian state officially amended its legislation and declared Ukraine to be a non-bloc status, officially refusing from joining any military or defense unions. That was some kind of creature of, at that time, President Yanukovych, but just for international audience to keep always in mind that when Russia offended Ukraine in 2014, occupied Crimea, later on occupied 30% at that time of Ukrainian Donbas, there was absolutely no movement within previous 4 years on the side of Ukraine towards NATO or any other defense alliance. So Ukraine has already tried against, by the way, of expert position in Ukrainian society, against some part of Ukrainian public, try to be like non-alliance country. And Russia just used that at that time, and that was a good lesson for Ukraine. So that's now neutrality or non-alliance with any defense unions is not already, it's obvious, is not a way out for Ukraine. On the contrary, Ukraine has to look for some kind of, because being out of any defense alliances, not only NATO, but bilateral, multilateral other defense alliances with specific partners, like we are discussing right now about like Poland, UK, some Baltic states probably. So Ukraine does need actually some kind of security guarantees from partner states, because neutral will be treated by Russia as is already did, like vacuum of security, lack of capacities to defend itself, because Russia doesn't want Ukraine just to be outside of NATO. Russia does want Ukraine to be not capable of giving military response to any kind of new offensive on the side of Russia. And that means that Ukraine should be demilitarized from Russian point of view. Ukraine doesn't need to have army. And if to refer to, for instance, Istanbul, negotiations which were going on in March, already after large-scale invasion. So what Russia did want from Ukraine, that Ukraine shouldn't become the part of any kind of defense alliance, not only NATO. And moreover, that even the military exercise of Ukrainian army cannot be conducted without permission from Russia. This is violation, actually, a direct violation would be of Ukrainian sovereignty, because external power has to decide if you can, adopt some decisions within your country in the framework of defense or your military policy. So no, neutrality is not an answer. And we now see that Russia only benefited from the fact that no one is fighting with Ukraine against Russia.
Mm-hmm. And what about water supply to Crimea?
Water supply to Crimea will be in place, because Crimea will be deoccupied in the framework of this military, actually, operation.
As I understood you correctly, you mean that Crimea is a part of Ukraine, and when Crimea will be liberated, then water.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Russia did a huge mistake with everything related to this invasion, to this large-scale invasion. First of all, because before February 24, there was some kind of silent agreement, let's say, especially on the side of international community. So everyone de facto has used to the fact that Crimea is occupied. Russia didn't agree to have any negotiations about Crimea, regardless that negotiations about Donbas were not constructive, but about Crimea, Russia even didn't think about entering any negotiation. So Ukraine was just alone. When 2 years ago it started, it created the Crimean platform, the international alliance or international group of Ukrainian partners, confirming that Crimea has to be returned under Ukrainian control and starting just, bringing Crimea back to international agenda. But general international community was silently got used already to the fact that Crimea is occupied, and no one wanted to, to push this message that Crimea should be returned to Ukraine strongly into the agenda, let's say. But when Russia invaded Ukraine on a large scale, level, so the perception of this composition of relations between Ukraine and Russia has completely changed. First of all, for Ukraine, and the occupation of the entire territory of Ukraine is now the part of perception of Ukrainian victory. And regardless of even the decisions of Ukrainian authorities, which are already about that, so that the whole Ukraine has to be deoccupied, including Crimea, of course. But there is a huge public request. And that's why even if authorities would like to change, let's say, their model of what Ukrainian victory should look like, how Ukrainian victory should look like, then there is a huge public request. More than 70% of Ukrainians back in August 2022, so it's already the half of the year in this war, saying that the victory of Ukraine should look like liberation and the occupation of entire territory of Ukraine, including Crimea. And when we measured in the framework of whether Ukrainians might think that, for instance, de facto agreement with occupation of Crimea can be treated as a price for end of the war on the continental Ukraine, part of Ukraine, let's say. So only 7% believed that it is acceptable way out of the conflict to, let's say, forget about Crimea in exchange of end of military battle with Russia on continental part of Ukraine.
Mhm. These thoughts of Musk, unfortunately, this is not a rare example, especially on the territory of so-called global South. And now there are a lot of discussion about what should Ukraine do to win in informational competition with Russia on these important countries. What do you think? Why Ukraine? I cannot say lost this fight, but which problem do you see in this area, and what Ukraine should do to show Ukrainian view and to make Ukrainian view on this conflict much more popular in these countries than it is now?
First of all, Ukraine has to be present in informational space of Africa, Middle East, Latin America, Asia, because before large-scale invasion, wide public and even political elites of these countries were hardly aware of the very existence of Ukraine as an absolutely sovereign state. So that was a real problem, or they were not interested in that. So Ukraine actually appeared in the informational space of symbolic or like so to say global South mainly after invasion of Russia in February, and that's the problem, because Russia was working in informational area like with let's say the intelligence framework. So there were experts responsible for specific countries or specific regions, experts present in these regions for not just years but for decades. They are speaking local languages, and that was the resource which Ukraine didn't have at all. So the first idea is just to be present there as much as possible in order to create the very idea that there is alternative. Maybe people will not believe the alternative to Russian narrative position, but at least there shouldn't be just one narrative. But if we are not there, then we are not there, and there is no even no chance. The second important, let's say, problem and is that there is no one global South, let's say, but like all these regions have their own histories. But at the same time, in this global South, there is general absolutely different attitude toward those countries and towards those states which are partners and which are like good players for Ukraine, let's say. This anti-Western attitude, anti-Western sentiments present in Middle East, in Africa. It's the result of, for instance, the policy which was conducted by Western European countries or by America back in, let's say, even 19th century, then in 20th century. Anti-Americanism is really a big problem for Ukraine to get support from some countries, like in the Middle East, for instance, because we need to understand the local context, so that the very reaction of people knowing not too much about Russia and Ukraine, Russia is playing with this, and Russia underlines. For instance, I have an experience of working with Middle East countries, and Russia plays the game like underlining all the time in all the media, that if America is helping Ukraine, then you should not support Ukraine. That's very straightforward logic, because Middle East has specific relations with America. There is a very fresh memory from Iraq war. and of course, people are starting doubting actually the very truth or the narrative coming from Ukrainian side. Despite this fact, there is still possibility to work with such regions, but just to keep in mind that narratives have to be adopted to the local context. And of course, the third moment is that we need to offer something for the future. I mean, very frequent response from, for instance, African countries or from African NGOs or even human rights activists in response towards Ukraine request to support Ukraine in this war is that, like, you was never interested in the wars and the conflicts which took place in Africa for decades. So why should we care about you? So that's very emotional reaction. Like, you were not interested, you were not present here, you didn't help us, you didn't see any significance in our continent. So why should we care about you? While Russia is our partner, it's inherited like political relations with this continent after the Soviet Union. They have huge military supplies to many countries, and they have built up some kind of diplomacy there. And that's why we need to offer something. First of all, we need to offer the defendants of the international order, because if in the center of Europe that the borders of the state can be reshaped just by the usage of force, then what to say about Africa? What are the prospects of Africa? What are the prospects of other countries in Asia, in Middle East? So just it's time probably to bring the global powers to compliance with international rules. And we don't know if this message will work with especially African countries. It's a very difficult story, complicated story for Ukraine in terms of diplomacy and informational space, but it's still the path we should try to move on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk about Ukraine. You're a sociologist with very profound experience in research, and maybe you know Russian so-called sociologists, they conducted so-called research on occupied territory, which allegedly showed that allegedly people support annexation. They presented this research before referendum, so-called, as some sign that referendum, the results of referendum will be correct, would be correct. What do you think about possibility of relevant research in situation of the war, in situation of occupation? Is it reliable at all, and is it possible to ask people this very insensitive question in this situation?
It's the short answer is no, it's not possible to conduct public opinion polls or voting on occupied territories. So if to speak from methodological point of view, there is absolutely well-studied effects of conducting any kind of sensitive questioning of people in the time of being like under security threats, and that people tend to either avoid any kind of participation in such pollings, or they give answers which are expected from them because of security threats to them. And that is why, by the way, even not in the time of let's say fresh military developments like we're now in recently occupied territories of Ukraine, but even in the case of Donbass, which was partially occupied in 2014 by Russia, me and my colleagues, we insisted that polling in occupied territories is not relevant. There is such a definition as validity. It means that you can even organize everything methodologically like perfect. You will gather the data. You will ask the needed number of people. Let's just imagine this ideal perfect situation, but the results which you will receive will not represent and will not actually reflect the real moods, exactly because of these security threats, if people give some answers which are not expected from them. And just to explain the why sociologists are so anxious about and so concerned about such kind of approaches, even without any occupation, even without any security threats from armed people who are present, like troops of another state who are present in your settlement. Let's imagine absolutely normal democratic society which has no occupation or any like security threats to the people. Let's imagine the small settlement like a village and a public opinion poll there about political preferences on the eve of some votings. And the overall population, or the absolute majority in this very settlement, in this very village, is in favor of political party A. But you, as also a citizen of this village, you will be, on the contrary, a voter, potential voter. You will be follower of political party B, who is treated to be absolutely radical opponent of political party A. And when sociologists come to you and ask you whom you would vote for in case the elections are taking place right now, in case the elections were now, that's already well-studied effect. I stress it, even for calm situations, that in these situations, people usually tend to answer that they would vote for that party which gets absolute majority support in this small settlement. And that's why sometimes in the results of elections, some kind of radical parties or parties which are treated to be like direct opponents of party who gets the support from majority in this region or in this town, they give unprecedented, they show unprecedented results on elections, because within public opinion polls, usually people even they try to keep silence about their political preferences, even in the time of like traditional public opinion polls. This effect is very well known. It's even not about security. It's mainly about, you know, tending to give a comfortable for the majority or for the interviewer's answer, but to go and vote according to your real expectations. And this effect, which change actually the results of the public opinion polls in normal peaceful situation, gets into methodological, systematical defect of any kind of polls when there is security threats for your health and life, when you are under occupation of another state troops in your country, when you are afraid to say anything which will not comply with the position of occupational forces in your region. So that's why, even from methodological point of view, when it comes to occupied territories, it's absolutely useless and it's absolutely invalid to say that we know some numbers and we have questioned people and that we receive some results. So no, in occupied territories, it's not possible to conduct public opinion polls, exactly because people will think about their security and about preservation and of their life and health.
Mm-hmm. If we analyze the situation with public opinion in Ukraine, what do you think about the main changes after the direct invasion of Russia? What the most significant changes do you see which characterize the situation in public opinion now in Ukraine?
First of all, Ukrainian public opinion has consolidated to a great extent, and any kind of internal, let's say, variations about the price of peace or the way of resolution of this conflict, they have actually put aside. So as of now, more than 90% of Ukrainians, according to face-to-face public opinion polls conducted in controlled by Ukrainian area, by Ukrainian state territories, they underline that Ukraine will win in this war, and this belief and trust in the war, in the victory of Ukraine in this war, it doesn't go down. It does not. It's not decreased. The latest opinion poll was in the middle of August. Then the next important point I would say is that serious increase of trust into public institutions. Actually, all the public institutions, state institutions related to security and defense of Ukrainian state, like National Guard, National Emergency Service, what to say even about Army, which had like very high support even during previous years. So all the National Police, even Security Service, so all the defense and security bodies, they have gained the huge increase in terms of public trust to them. So now, and this is something which should be considered as a response, of course, to the security threat and necessity of public institutions to be effective. So president has the president, armed forces of Ukraine, they have one of the highest rates of public trust, and for instance, the like difference. So the increase of public support to Ukrainian president was one of the biggest in comparison to what was in 2021 and what we have now at the end of this summer. The third important point, which relates to the war, I would say, is that people are not ready to treat to consider the victory of Ukraine the situation when some part of Ukrainian territory will be still occupied. And that's very important to understand that it's not about the position just of some politicians or decision makers. It's about some kind of public moods, because right now, like as I already mentioned, more than 70% is saying that when asked what is this victory you are believing in, how does it look like? More than 70% say that Russian troops have to be withdrawn from entire territory of Ukraine, including Crimea. And plus to the 70, we have like 20% with even more radical scenario that not Russian troops have to be withdrawn on the one hand, but on the other hand, Russian political regime and Russian state in its current form have to be disintegrated, destabilized, or collapsed. So they go further. But the liberation of Ukrainian territory is very important condition to say for Ukrainian society that this is the end of the war, which can be called like victory of Ukraine. If some part is occupied, then there will be a different perception of the end of the war and not like a victory of Ukraine. And the last but not the least, of course, important for me point, one of the most important points to me, is that in the time of the war, it might be surprisingly, but the interest or the interest of people in, let's say, the governance with like in Ukraine, we say like a strong hand governance, strong leader governance. The support to this kind of governance was not, didn't increase the request for democratic governance increase. So while choosing between two types of governing, like democracy on the one hand, and the symbolically saying a regime of a strong hand of a strong leader, so people, even in the times of the war, choosing democracy and the support to democratic model of governance has even increased since last year. And to us, to people working with public opinion, that's some kind of a sign that there is an internal coming from inside of Ukrainian, from within of Ukrainian society, some kind of safety back for not turning into any autocratic regime, even in the times of the war.
Mhm. Thank you, Maria. Thank you for your answer. Thank you for your time. Hope see you again.